Welcome to the Counter Narrative Podcast, a show designed to change the way we talk and think about education. I'm Charles Williams, and together we'll explore untold stories, bold ideas, and innovative approaches that transform our schools and communities. Let's get started.
As always, thank you so much for rejoining. I'm hoping that as you're watching these new episodes, you'll notice things are changing, right? Obviously, the videos, the backgrounds are different, just little things here and there. And I don't know what order they're all going to be falling. So you'll be able to figure that out as you're watching them. But man, I am excited for today's episode. And I know I say that a lot. I really do. But this one feels different. I was just having a podcast conversation, if you will. And so, as you all know, and I'm not shy about this, that not only do I run a podcast, but I also listen to podcasts. I have that very, very long commute. And so I listen to podcasts quite often. And so a few months ago, I thought, I want to do something a little bit different. So I was on Audible, plug for Audible. They are not paying me, I wish, but they plug for Audible. And I came across something called The Great Courses. And I thought, hey, Charles, if you're going to be sitting in a car for 3 hours a day, you might as well learn a little something and not just listen to your friends, share some of those ideas. And so I'll be honest, I tried one, it was horrible, it was boring. I tried another one. I won't say their titles, and I was just like, ugh. I said, all right, I'm going to try one more. And there was one that caught my attention, and it was neurodiversity and the myth of normal. And I thought, this sounds interesting. I hope it's not boring. And I started playing it, and the two individuals speaking, Kyler and Dan, and they caught my attention right away, so much so that I binged the entire thing. I mean, there were times I was sitting in my car listening to it when I got to work, when I got home, and I was like, I don't know where to stop. And so immediately I thought, I have to get them on. And so this person you've seen waiting patiently here is Daniel, because he is one of the authors, one of the individuals that you will hear, and I encourage you to go listen to this. And I said, please come on the show. I want to talk about neurodiversity. I want to talk about how this impacts school. I want to talk about your experiences. I want to talk about the show. I want to talk about all the things. So Daniel, thank you so much for being here.
It's my pleasure. I'm excited to be here. I greatly appreciate the glowing review. As an author, I just want people to read my stuff, period. And so that they read it and then also like it, that's a bonus. But yeah, I think this is such an important conversation, and I'm really, really looking forward to sharing some ideas with your audience.
Now, I will be honest, I didn't read the book. I listened. And one of the things that I loved about it was that both your and Kyler's personality really came through, which is something I don't know if I would have gotten if I read it. Now, I'm not saying don't go out and buy it. Like, if you go out, buy it. Because I will tell you, as I was listening, I wanted to take notes, which is a very bad thing to do when you're trying to drive. So I would not recommend it. So definitely get the book. I will be picking that up so I could jot down all these notes and the things that we talked about. But I think as we begin to dive in, before we jump into the meat of the conversation, can you give me a quick rundown? If somebody were to ask you, like, Daniel, what is this about? This neurodiversity, this myth of normal? What do you mean the myth of normal? Like, what would you say for somebody who is curious about listening or reading the book?
Yeah. So I think that the best way to kind of frame it is using one of the core examples that Kyler and I use in the book itself. So Kyler is left-handed. And when he was a kid in kindergarten, his left-handedness caused him huge trouble because his teacher was kind of backwards thinking and insisted that he try to do everything with his right hand. So you imagine a kid trying to learn to write, a kid trying to, color, a kid trying to, throw a ball during recess, whatever, all using, the hand that's not their dominant hand. He struggled as a result of that. But then once he got out of kindergarten, suddenly he could just start using his left hand. He could start engaging in the world in a way that was natural to him. And all of those problems that he was experiencing kind of melted away because he did not change. He was still left-handed, but the world responded to him differently. Whereas for me, I'm autistic. And, growing up, I also had challenges, right? I also had people who didn't understand me, people who tried to change me. rejection, like all of the difficulties that you would expect. Except in my case, I was able to kind of find a pathway forward through changing myself, through learning how to engage socially in the way that people expected, through learning how to kind of mask my autistic traits or, act like neurotypical people expected me to act. And that was, challenging. There was problems that come from that. And many autistic people aren't able to make that same kind of change that I made. And so they keep experiencing that rejection all of their life. And really the question of the book kind of is sort of asking, well, why is it that we accept some differences, but not all differences? And what if we were able to change how we responded to differences such as autism and ADHD? And, instead of saying, okay, you need to act the way that we expect, we started saying, how could we flexibly respond to you in a way that's going to work best for you? And obviously people, when they hear that, they're like, okay, but doesn't, being autistic mean that you really aren't as good at some things, or doesn't have ADHD mean that you really are, have difficulties with attention? And of course, there's weaknesses and challenges that come from different conditions, but there's strengths that come from different conditions too. It's kind of like, if LeBron James decides that he wants to live in a house with, doors that are 4 feet tall, he's going to have a really hard time. But, if he gets on the basketball court, he's going to have a great time because, he's a really tall guy. And so it's a difference that comes with pros and cons in the same way that autism comes with pros and cons. And many of the cons, and this is sort of the core idea, many of the cons or the things that we view as deficits or problems are not intrinsic to the condition itself, but are the result of how we as a society have chosen to respond to that, condition. So again, if everywhere that LeBron went, every door was 4 feet high, he would really struggle. But you can make doors that are 7 feet high, and then LeBron would have no problem. And in the same way, as an autistic person, I could go to a job interview, and that job interview could be set up such that if I don't make good eye contact, they're not going to give me the job. Or the job interview could be set up such that they look at my work sample and they decide, more objectively if I would be a good fit or not. That's a choice that we can make in how we design our environments, and we can make choices that make it more accessible for everybody. Yeah, I could keep talking, but that's the that's the intro to it.
No, I appreciate it, and I think that leans itself into that idea of this myth of normal, right? What we define as normal and who isn't normal for, and I love that, right? I think when I reached out to you, I said one of the reasons why this episode, or the series of episodes, because if you listen to it on Audible, it's actually a series. One of the reasons why it resonated was, my grandson has autism. My daughter has been diagnosed with anxiety and ADHD. And so many of the things that you were sharing between you and Kyler as I was listening, it not only resonated with me, but I think it reinforced many of the concepts, beliefs. I nearly cried from time to time, because it was like, here are people that understand. Right. And what if, as you asked, what if we lived in a world where we didn't view these things as deficiencies or wrong, right? These things that are lacking, but simply as things that are different, right? And because everybody's a little bit different is that normal, right? And accept that space. So I'm curious, I want to jump in just a little bit here. When we talk about like autism, or ADHD or anxiety, or any of these spaces of being neurodivergent within school, what are some of the things that you've heard of that you're just like, that's not the case, right? There's any of those things that you want to push back on? Because I'm sure, right, that you've been in spaces and somebody has said something, you're just kind of like, no.
Yeah. I think, there's so many things that
where do I start?
Yeah, but I think I'll highlight maybe a few of them. I think that one that comes to mind is that oftentimes people will sometimes talk about autism through the lens of like, oh, it's a superpower. And that is, I think that the intentions are good, right? They're trying to take something from being viewed as a problem to being viewed as a good thing. But I think that can cause autistic people to sort of be like put into a box or the whole person being missed, right? So it might be like, wow, like, that autistic person, their special interest is, trains, and they could tell you, 500 facts about every train that you could ever want to ask about. That's really impressive. Most people couldn't do that. But if you're like, oh, well, but they have a superpower, and, maybe one day we'll get them a job, sharing train facts or something. Well, but this person probably also likes listening to music. This person probably also likes eating their favorite meal. This person probably, there's so many facets to this person beyond just, oh, they can do this thing better than other people can. And I mean, there might be autistic people that don't have a special ability. They just have normal abilities or typical abilities. And that's okay too. It shouldn't be that I can be like Rain Man, from the movie and solve a calculus equation in order to be accepted and valued. Just the fact that I'm here and a human being and capable of love and being loved should be enough for me to be kind of accepted, in whatever community I'm wanting to be a part of. So I think that first thing of saying it's not about them being superpowered, it's also not about them being, pity cases that are so terrible, but what if we just saw them as people? And I think honestly, this kind of gets into this idea of the myth of normal, because I think that why I call it a myth is because we often try to put people in these boxes of, well, you're normal and you're not normal. And so, all right, well, this kid, they're not autistic, so they're normal. And so we can understand that they have strengths and weaknesses. We can understand that maybe, their mom loves them, but they're not going to be an Olympic athlete. There's nothing world-class about them. That's okay, because there's nothing world-class about most of us, right? It's a big world. But then this person, they're autistic, they're not normal, so the rules don't apply to them in the same way. I would say, why not just offer acceptance to everybody? And also realize that, if we put somebody in one box or another box, that's extremely arbitrary. If you go into a Silicon Valley tech company, the normal thing would probably be for you to have some autistic traits, right? And so I think that's another reason why the goal is to kind of extend this sort of inclusivity and acceptance to everybody, rather than saying, we need to view autistic people as other and come up with these convoluted ways of, oh, they're superheroes or whatever to understand them.
No, I really enjoy that. In fact, like you said, I was in New York, back in, I think it was January, February, and my wife and I went up, we did a lot of the touristy things. We did the Empire State Building tour. And one of the big things when you go up there is this drawing, right? That was done by a gentleman, Stephen, who is autistic, and he took the helicopter ride, right? And then he drew the entire skyline from memory. And it's this big thing. And I remember I purchased a copy of it because I was like, man, I want to support individuals with autism. I think this is a beautiful thing that we're leaning into, but I can understand the danger in that and saying, hey, you know what? We're going to put you into this box. Because I'm sure in many areas, Stephen is known for the guy who can draw the skyline from, right? And it's like, does he have any other interests? Does he have any other abilities? And so it's a different way of thinking about that. And I appreciate you bringing that to the surface.
Yeah. I think about the guy that, it's a little bit of a side twist, but like, every year there's a hot dog eating competition, and, there's somebody that can eat like 30 hot dogs in a minute or something crazy. And it's an incredible ability, right? Most people could not do that. But would we look at that person and say, oh, well, that person is clearly better than other people? No, it's just a cool thing that they can do. Or me, I cannot eat 30 hot dogs in 1 minute. Does that mean that I'm bad or less deserving of attention? No. I think this, this is, I think, especially dangerous in educational settings, because I think that sometimes for autistic people, there's like autistic students can kind of get attention if they kind of fall in this exceptional bucket of, wow, they have some great ability. Wow, they scored a perfect on their SAT. All right, well, let's put resources to them. Or they fall in the bucket of, they're throwing a tantrum, every other class, they're punching the teacher, they're a big disruption. But there's so many kids that are in the middle that, like, they're not going to join Mensa. they're also not going to punch a teacher, but they still have maybe, unique needs that are being unmet. That, maybe they're a C plus student, but they could be a B plus student if you just gave them, the right environment, the right resources. But nobody thinks to do that because they're like, well, they're fine. And a B plus student isn't special. I want to put my resources into Mensa Guy. And I think that I would just encourage us to broaden our horizons and say, how can we make, things better for everybody, not just the people who are the worst off or the best off.
So that leads me to something that I wanted to bring up, because the moment I heard you all talk about it, and you mentioned this earlier, the idea that you said that when you used to try to mask, right? And we were talking about meeting needs of our students. And so one of the things that came up was this idea of stemming, right? And so like my grandson, obviously he would do it. And at first we weren't really sure, right? He's 7. This is a brand new journey for us. And so we've gotten to the point I ask him, hey, are you okay? Do you need anything? No, I'm just excited. Or he's able to communicate that now, right? As he's getting a little bit older. But we weren't sure how to respond in the beginning. And I remember a part where you said that you used to try to hide it, right? And the physical pain that would cause you because you weren't able to let that go. And so I know within schools, right, students do this, right? Whether it's a flapping of their hands, whether it's jumping, whether it's a noise that they're making, whatever that stimming looks like for them. And right, and obviously it's one of those things that looks different for each person. So can we talk just a little bit about that? Because I think one of the things that you said was like, I'm not in pain. It's not hurting me. I'm not crying out for help. This is my way of expressing something. So can we talk just a little bit about that?
Yeah. I think it's critical to realize that, like, yeah, I'm not in pain. Like, if I'm stimming, that's actually good for me. I like that. The pain might come from not being able to do that, or at least the discomfort. And also, I'm not causing pain to anybody else, right? Like this is just a thing that I'm doing that is different, but it's not harmful. And if somebody else has a problem with it, that's their problem with it, right? Like it's not. But I think because we have this. Sort of like rules that are based around normalcy, it might be like, well, okay, well, one student, they're going to, twirl their hair on their finger, and that's okay because we decide that that's normal. But another student is going to rock back and forth, and they're going to get sent to detention or asked to stop because that's not normal. And I just encourage this opening up of our creativity to say, well, like, what if, even if it's not quote unquote normal, what if we just say, well, as long as it's not hurting anybody, it's okay. And that's why I in the book I kind of argue for basing our judgment not on normal versus abnormal, because again, normal is a myth, but on values, right? Like, it can be a value that it's not okay for a student to hurt another student. And so if I'm doing, and my stim is punching somebody else in the face, well, then I'm not allowed to do that because that's going to hurt another student. But I think that if it doesn't violate a value, then I think we should say, all right, well, then that's just who that person is. That's what they want to do.
So I'm curious. We talked about two things here, right? This idea of putting people into boxes, the superpower mindset, right? In fact, and I loved her, so I will give a shout out to George up in Whitehall at the Comfort Inn and Suites. I was just up there this weekend, not this weekend of you listening to this podcast. By then it'll be a couple, whatever it is.
Hello, people in the future.
Hello. But as I mentioned to you, we took my grandson on a small trip, as we're trying to get him acclimated to these differences, these changes. And when he went into the room and was like, "No, I don't like it." Right. And we didn't know what it was about the room. So I went down to the front desk and said, "Hey, can we try a different room?" And I was nervous, I'll be honest, right? I was like, my grandson's on the spectrum and he doesn't like the room. And she just looked at me and was like, "That's absolutely fine." And I was just like, "Wait, what? Like, you're okay with this?" She was like, "Absolutely. Like, let's try out a few rooms." And so we were able to explore rooms until we found one that was like, "This is the room I like." Right. And we didn't know what was different about that room. It's a hotel, right? 2 queen beds, bathroom, like your usual setup. But for whatever reason, that room was special to him. And for her, for George up there and I will say it, George at Whitehall at Comfort Inn and Suite, like, didn't bat an eye. right? And so I wish that was the experience for more people, but clearly that isn't the case. We're talking about the stimming, the superpower boxes. And so in your experience, like, why do you think people, educators in particular, are so quick to do these things, right? To lean into that myth of normal within our educational spaces.
Yeah. I think, well, I think it's two things. I mean, there's one, which is we are operating within extremely broken educational systems, right? And I think that if you're like, oh my goodness, I'm overloaded. I've got twice as many kids as any one teacher should be able to handle. I'm not getting paid enough to take good care of myself. I've got parents screaming at me. Well then, of course, the kid that needs a little bit of extra attention, extra care, it's hard to give that. And I think I just want to like acknowledge the human nature of like, I know that a lot of teachers are doing the best that they can, even, and I think that on some level, this goes to, school administrators, this goes to government authorities that assign budgets, this goes to the people that need to create systems that allow teachers to do their best work. I think that the other thing that maybe feeds into it, or that's a necessary precondition, is for teachers to be able to, I think, offer this idea of what I call compassionate curiosity. Because oftentimes when a neurodivergent person has a need, that's a need that a neurotypical person doesn't really have. They don't maybe, and so on first glance, maybe the need doesn't feel valid to them. It doesn't feel legitimate. And sometimes, like in that case, our minds can go to this judgmental kind of place, right? Like the person at the hotel might have thought, oh, like this kid is just spoiled, or this kid is just seeking attention, or this, these parents don't know how to say no to a kid, or whatever. All of these negative, interpretations that we're sometimes tempted to do, especially when we're stressed. We got to know things going on. But I think if instead we can do compassionate curiosity, then it allows us to build empathy. And compassionate curiosity, it's very simple. It's just two parts, two words. The compassion part is basically where you assume that the other person is a decent person who is trying to do good things. So, your grandkid is not trying to ruin the trip, right? They're not trying to make the front desk person upset. Like they have good intentions. And so then the curiosity part is to say, why would somebody who's a decent person who has good intentions, why would that good person do this thing that to me seems bad? And if we start to think through that, then oftentimes we're able to reach, we're able to reach an answer. Like one of my friends is actually a teacher. She was telling me a story of working, with a neurodivergent student who was just like, being disruptive. And then she was, instead of just punishing him, she was able to sit him down and be like, hey, what's going on? He's like, I'm so bored. And so, got the kid a coloring book, and all the bad behavior went away. And it's like, I mean, sure, we would hope that people someday would learn how to get their needs met without being disruptive. But I mean, they're kids. And so it's our responsibility as the adults, as the educators, to help them identify what their needs are. But that has to start with us assuming that the bad behavior is based in a legitimate need, rather than assuming that the bad behavior is because they're stinkers.
I love that compassionate curiosity, and I would be willing to say, and I'm going to challenge teachers on this, to say, I think a lot of times for us as adults, that's where the problem really lies. In my experience within schools, this more often than not, the students have been phenomenal with their peers in these spaces. We were at we had an assembly. We had a young man who was very verbal, right? They were making a lot, and we weren't sure what it was, right? He was trying to communicate something. Something was setting him off, and the kids were not like, what's he doing, right? They accepted it. They were like, hey, this is who he is. He's not disrupting, right? He's not intending to be disruptive to the entire assembly. But I remember some adults were trying to like, hey, I need you to calm down, which obviously is not going to work, right? Like, I'm not listening to that. And at the end of the day, what one of the students actually pointed out was, I think he wants a ticket, right? Because
Mhm.
when students were answering questions, they were getting a ticket. And the student's nonverbal, so he couldn't really answer the question. So the noises that we heard was his response, his attempt to answer the question. And he's like, why am I not getting a ticket? So I'm
Mhm.
going to keep I'm going to keep answering so I can get a ticket. And the moment we're like, well, let's try it. The moment we gave him a ticket, he was fine. He sat through 2 assemblies because all he wanted was that ticket. And the moment he got it, I'm ready to move on to my next thing. Right.
Mhm.
And so a lot of times in my experience, I think our students, right? Because whatever it is that they're experiencing in the world around them, they're a little more liable to engage in this compassionate curiosity that you mentioned. But I love those 2 words, compassionate curiosity.
Mhm. Yeah. No, I think, and that's a fantastic, example of the ticket thing. And yeah, like that it would be so easy to be like, oh, just like kick him out, put him in the broom closet for the assembly. But you know, um, but or even just let's just all pretend it's not happening and just kind of tolerate it, which would have been unpleasant for everybody, but especially for him because he wanted his ticket, right? If you just ignore him, then he doesn't get what he needs. And so yeah, like that curiosity, that extra attention, I think is huge, and I think that leads a little bit into kind of this discussion of like designing environments and how do we set up you know systems, processes, physical spaces such that more needs are kind of like preemptively met. Because I think that one of the biggest challenges with neurodivergent people, especially with kids, is that like they don't always know, or we don't always know what it is that we need. And I mean, I think that that's true for everybody, right? Like, I'm a psychologist. A lot of times somebody comes to my therapy clinic and a lot of the work is just be like, all right, well, like what's going on in your life? What's your unmet need? We got to figure that out before we can help them feel better. But I think the thing that's critical to understand of why it's more difficult for neurodivergent people is because the world is just kind of by default set up for neurotypical people. And so many of the needs that neurotypical people have are automatically met without them ever having to think about it because their system was designed by another neurotypical person, right? Like if I was going to invent a pair of scissors, I would invent right-handed scissors. If Kyler was going to invent scissors, he would invent left-handed scissors because we're going to build it for how it works for us. And I think that that's why it's so critical to, be able to rethink how we set things up and not just say, all right, how can we maybe accommodate this person or squeeze this, flex a little bit so that this kind of works for this person, but is it possible to kind of like from the ground up
Mhm.
imagine how this class, this assembly, this ceremony, this job interview, this whatever, might work if it was designed for the ground up to be to meet the needs of everybody, not just typical needs.
No, I love the fact that you're saying this, right? It's not about like adjusting our space to say, hey, we're gonna fit you in, right? We're going to say, hey, let's create a whole new space, right? So everybody can be accommodated because the reality is, as we're doing this work for one group of people, we should be doing it for multiple groups of people. In fact, as I get to travel and speak, right, whenever I bring up the concept of diversity or equity work, right, people look at me and they're like, oh, well, you're going to talk about like the role of like for African Americans. And I was like, there's other groups. Right. So when we talk about diversity and equity, it's a very broad range. And so I'm curious. I'm hoping that as people are listening to this, as they're watching us talk, one, I'm hoping that they're generating some questions because I want to be able to have multiple conversations with you, Daniel. But one of the things that I'm curious, you're talking about this new space, right? Maybe at the point, the plan is that this podcast will be launched at the beginning of the school year. So maybe it's still early on. And I'm thinking about my classroom. I'm thinking about my school. I'm thinking about whatever space it is that I'm occupying. And I'm thinking, how can I go about that? Right? How can I not accommodate, but how can I break and rebuild in something brand new? So can you give some ideas and suggestions of whether ways that could happen, or even tips, ideas, resources, whatever it might be, so I can begin that journey?
Yeah, I think that the biggest thing that comes to mind for me is being able to move, is being able to create a community of genuine belonging for all of your students, not just for the students that have the easiest time schmoozing other students, or whatever. And I I like to kind of use the framing of moving from acceptance to inclusion to belonging, because acceptance is just the absence of rejection, right? Like if I decide to go to, Panera Bread and have a mac and cheese, and there's somebody sitting at another table, I'm not going to get into a fight and try to get them kicked out of Panera Bread. I accept that they are there. But we don't really have any kind of connection. Versus if I invite my friend to meet me at Panera Bread, I don't know why I'm talking about. I must be hungry right now. But like if I invite my friend to meet me at a restaurant,
also not supporting
not,
the podcast. But hey,
but hey,
Panera, if you want
Panera
to.
executives, if you're listening, this is a good marketing opportunity. Anyway, so if I sit down at a restaurant with my friend, I've included my friend, I've invited them there. But then if I go home for Thanksgiving and my sister isn't there, Thanksgiving isn't the same, because my sister belongs at Thanksgiving. It's an integral part of that experience. It's not just that I want her there, that I need her there to be a part of the Thanksgiving community, right? And I think that what we want in our classrooms is to try to build that in so that each student feels like this is a place where I belong. This is a community that wouldn't quite be the same without me. And obviously this is a tall order, but there's a couple of things that can be done that move towards that. I think one is trying to create opportunities for collaboration, because one of the things that we've seen works the most in bonding people together is kind of striving towards a shared purpose. There was a famous psychological study, back in the 50s or 60s, back before they invented ethics in psychological research, where these researchers took like these two groups of boys. It was called the Robbers Cave experiment. They took them to a summer camp, made the boys compete. The two groups ended up like hating each other. Like they would break into the other one's cabin and throw their underpants in the lake and stuff like that. But then after they had like primed these boys to hate each other, they made the boys start to work together, start to collaborate. And then suddenly, they bonded and they were unified. And in the same way, if you can find ways where, people in your classroom have to rely on each other a little bit, have to work together. I mean, group projects can be difficult. So you got to design it in a way where, it builds, connection rather than resentment, but that's a possible thing to do, right?
Sure.
I also think that looking out for people that are most on the margins and bringing them into contact with people that are maybe a little bit more accepting can also help to work against somebody, disconnecting. So there's an idea that I've heard of called the classroom X-ray from a blog called Momastery, which is just excellent. But it's basically a teacher that like every month or whatever would allow students to write in, hey, tell me, 3 people that you want to sit next to when I reorganize the seating chart. And what she would do, it wasn't really about the seating chart. It was about looking to see who are the students that nobody wants to sit next to. Because those are the students that, are I got to look out for. And then maybe when I reorganize the seating chart, I'm going to put them next to the students who are the most friendly or the most accommodating or the, whoever, or, or somebody that I think they'll get along with. And so kind of that deliberate effort of, making it easier for them to connect. And the nice thing about like designing in this way to build this belonging and this inclusion is that even though you're designing it kind of to help maybe neurodivergent people who might struggle, this helps everybody, right? Because you could have a super neurotypical kid who is still, doesn't make any friends in class or is lonely or could use a place to belong or whatever. And so if you design your classroom for everybody, for the neurodivergent people, those students are going to flourish as well.
Absolutely. I really like this that idea. I'm like, I think I'm going to take this back, to some of these teachers in my building. Say, who are the students that we're forgetting about, right? In fact, one of the activities that I do, I say, hey, think about the people in your building, right? Now think about those who you didn't think about. Right, like we have clubs and organizations and special places for you to meet after school, after the day is done. Now you can go and be with people that accept you, right? And it's like, well, why do we have to have that club or organization? So,
Mm-hmm.
so thank you for that. And I want to give a plug. when you talked about the idea of group work, there is a strategy out there. It's from Kagan. Again, no support. I gotta stop promoting all these other people, but they have this thing called pies, right? Which does talk about that positive interdependence, right? There's something called group work where you get your hogs and logs, but then you have collaborative work. And I think that lends itself to that space that you were talking about, where I'm an integral part of the work that we're doing, right? Like, you need me to be a part of it. I can contribute, allow me to be a part of this, and not push me off to the side. And yet somehow you're still successful, right?
Mhm.
If we can create those spaces where I need to be involved, right, then you could begin to see me for who I truly am. And so thank you
Mhm.
for surfacing that.
Yeah, I think just to share two quick things on that. Um, yeah, like when I was in high school, I did some kind of team building exercise. And the thing that I remember is that it was like we all had to stand on like this block. And like the solution is that everybody puts like a toe on the block and you hold hands and lean backwards. But then me being an autistic high schooler, when we're in the post group debrief, I'm like, it occurs to me that it would have been a lot easier for me to stand on the block if I had just been on my own. Like everybody else just made this harder. And like everybody's like, Daniel, you can't say that. But like I was objectively correct, right? Like that exercise really would have been easier if I had just done it on my own. And so I think that, yeah, like we want to avoid that kind of thing. We want to avoid a group project where the kid that wants to get into college does all the work. But if you are aware of those threats, I'm confident, using the pies idea. I'm going to look that up for sure, or a different way. Like you can design something that actually everybody contributes in a different way. Um, I think the other thing that I would say is that maybe an example of that is that I had the honor of speaking at the No Barriers conference last year, it's a conference that was founded by the first blind man to ever summit Mount Everest. And it's just like incredibly like inspirational, amazing people. I was like, are you sure you guys want to invite me to speak here? Because it was like, it was a musician who was deaf but had learned to still play music. It was an artist who was blind but still knew how to paint. Although there was a dog that learned how to walk on its hind legs, and so I feel like I was at least more impressive than the dog. Like its front legs had been injured and then it learned to walk on its hind legs. Anyway, No Barriers conference. It's really cool, but they had like the No Barriers like summit adventure, which was these series of activities, and you would be put into a team of mixed abilities. But the key is that the events were designed such that the different abilities of the team meant that everybody could like really contribute in a unique way. So, for instance, we had one event where we had to, I think, like move, like balance a thing and move it in a very steady way. And we had a group member that was in a wheelchair, and because it was an electric wheelchair, he could set an exact pace, right? And that was critical to us winning that event because instead of me stepping, every step is going to be a little bit more or less. His wheelchair led the group to victory, and it was designed, that way to allow for those sorts of things to happen. And that, like, again, it doesn't take, I think, brilliance to design an event that does that. It just takes a shifting of priorities to imagine not how can I design a classroom experience that's the same as every other experience that I've seen, but to say, how can I design an experience that's going to allow, as you said, those people that I don't think of to participate and contribute in a full way, because that's what's going to create, I think, not just a belonging, but also the sense of pride, the sense of agency, the growth mindset, that belief of, wow, I can do this. What else can I do? That's what we want to create for our kids.
Absolutely. And I would love if we did that so often that myth of normal became the new normal of
Mm-hmm.
this is just how we operate, and everybody
Mm-hmm.
can participate, everybody's involved, everybody, their strengths are showing. So Daniel, I'm always surprised when I look down, I'm like, man, we're already 30 in. So I just want to pause really quick before we close things out, because I've enjoyed this conversation. I'm already planning to invite you back for a round two. But before we close out, I'm sure that individuals who are listening are like, I want to know more. I want to learn more. We talked about the audiobook is available on Audible. where else can they find the book? Where can they connect with you? Can they learn more about some of the work that you're doing?
Yeah. So the audiobook, unfortunately, is only available on Audible. It was an Audible exclusive contract. There's been huge interest in the book, and so we've asked them, hey, can we make a hard copy? And then they were like, no. And I'm like, could we make a Kindle? Like it's also owned by you guys, and they're like, no. So it's fine. So it's only an audiobook, unfortunately. But as you said, you get the benefit of hearing me and Kyler kind of go back and forth, which I think is really fun. So beyond that, beyond the Neurodiversity and Myth of Normal audiobook, you can stay connected with me directly just by going to danielwendler.com. It's I've got a Substack there that you can follow if you want my weird blogs or whatever I think about writing, or more information on neurodiversity. And then there's also information there on hiring me to speak, consult, because I love sharing about this stuff and happy to bring that to different audiences. And then if you want to just expand your knowledge beyond that, I think the book that honestly was really helpful for me in understanding neurodiversity better is the book "We're Not Broken." I think the subtitle is like changing it's something about autism. I forget the subtitle, but it's "We're Not Broken." The author is Eric Garcia, and it's a really excellent introduction to neurodiversity and an understanding of autism. I also recommend the Autism Self Advocacy Network. They're doing incredible work to kind of push forward this idea of nothing about us without us. And so rather than learning from some rando expert, listening from the lived experiences of autistic people, I think is huge. And then the final thing that I would recommend that people do for some further reading is to look more into the idea of the social model of disability and universal design. And these are ideas that didn't start with the neurodiversity movement. It started with the disability rights movement. However, they're really foundational for understanding, not just neurodiversity, but really a lot of how we as a society can respond to people, with different needs. And so, even just the Wikipedia article for social model of disability, universal design, if you start there, I think it'll take you 5 minutes, but you'll walk away understanding the world a little bit better.
I appreciate that. And I will be honest, that book, We're Not Broken, the moment you all mentioned it in the book, I was like, pause, order, got it. And so maybe, Eric, if you're listening somehow, I'll probably be reaching out to you. Daniel, maybe we all three of us could hop on and just have a conversation. This is something that is, as I mentioned earlier, is near and dear to me. And I think this is something that we just in the world of education need to have some more conversations around. If we're going to change the spaces that we're operating in, right? If we're going to change the way we talk and think about education, then let's have those conversations. So Daniel, I cannot say thank you enough, obviously, for jumping on the show and saying yes to my invite. But more importantly, just thank you for this work that you're doing. Thank you for being a person that is saying, hey, you know what, I'm going to stand up, I'm going to speak out, I'm going to share my truth and my reality so that people can understand. And I think, like you just said, for the best part of that is coming from somebody who's speaking their own lived experiences and not just something they read about. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Yeah, it's my pleasure and my honor. And I would just give a thank you, back to you for all the work that you're doing for your students, for your grandkid, and for everybody listening, everything that the listeners are investing in their students and the people in their life, because it really does matter. Like it can sometimes feel like, the challenge is so big or there's, so many obstacles in the way, but every little thing that you do, every piece of compassion, every action of mentorship, every action that you can do in love to somebody else, that does matter. That does make a difference. And sometimes you get to know. I had a time where I gave a talk, and 5 years later, somebody came up to me and talked about how that talk had impacted them. But sometimes you never get to know, and so you just need to do your best every day to make a positive impact, knowing that there's going to be a lot of fruit that comes from the seeds that you're planting, even if you don't see all of it.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for that powerful, powerful words to close us out. And so listeners, as always, until next time.